Welcome to the Manuscript Academy podcast,
brought to you by
a writer
and an agent
who both believe that education is key.
The beauty is the people you meet along the way,
and that community makes all the difference.
Here at the Manuscript Academy, you can learn the skills, make the connections, and have access to experts, all from home.
I'm Julie Kingsley.
And I'm Jessica Sinsheimer.
Put down your pens, pause your word counts, and enjoy.
Hi, everybody. We are here with author Bonnie Jo Pierson. She has a new novel that is fun and beautiful and thoughtful and heartfelt and comes with the best darn editor's note I've ever seen. Bonnie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell us about you.
Well, I am a small town Idaho girl. I married my husband in my 20s, and we went all over the country and ended up coming back to my great-grandparents' homesteaded farm. And that's where I have settled. I renovated their house. And so now I'm living in my great-grandparents' home and trying to resurrect their farm because it was neglected for a while. So it takes a lot of time and energy. But when I'm not doing that, I'm writing.
And tell us about your writing journey.
When my husband, he went to medical school, and I had just had my first baby, and we moved to St. Louis. I moved away from everybody familiar, and my daughter happened to sleep so much. She would sleep 6 hours a day and 12 hours at night. And so I was in my apartment all day just watching the sleeping baby. And so I started reading, and I would read a stack of books in a week that were as tall as me. And so I told my husband, I want to make one of these. I want to write one of these. And so he basically said, then do it. And so I opened my laptop, had the seed of an idea, and I started writing. And I had no clue, no outline, nothing, just a blank page. And I wrote this book, and it took me about a year to write it. And it was 120,000 words or 140,000 words of rambling, because it's a first draft of my ever, starting to write. And so I remember crying when I finished it, thinking this is the greatest thing ever. And then I went back and I started reading from the beginning. And I just was so embarrassed that my family had read those words because they were a lot more rough than I had thought they would be. They were a bit rougher. And so then I started the editing process of this book. And I spent a decade learning how to write, learning how to fix it, learning how to make it better. And I would have, put it under the mattress or shelved it. But a lot of my family members said that they were dreaming about my characters. And so they'd read my book and then they'd dream about my characters. And so I decided to find out what I did right in this book, because if I threw it out, then I wouldn't know what I had done right. And so I started just learning. And so that's the journey of writing it. And eventually it got to where I started joining writing groups and writing organizations like Manuscript Academy. And I ended up finding a lot of my writing groups through there. And the one in particular that kind of led me to my publisher was through the submission strategy workshop in, I believe, 2020. And we got together and they made connections, I made connections, and we helped each other. And eventually I found Rising Action through my friends in that group. And now it's getting published, 17 years after I opened my laptop and started writing. So
I love this so much. And the friends you meet along the way, it's so amazing. For the viewers, let me read to you the blurb about what happens in Idaho. Dr. Liliana Chase saves lives every day, but suffers from the loss of her husband and baby girl. And when her mother convinces her to come back to Idaho, she returns with the intent of leaving as soon as possible. She didn't expect to wreck her car while swerving to miss a cow with a death wish, or meeting a handsome mechanic who might be the one person to convince her life is worth living. Such a great blurb, because I think it really encompasses the book. So talk to us about Blake and Lily. Were they based on real people? This is 17 years ago. You've lived with them for a long time. So let's hear about them.
So Blake and Lily kind of started as a what if scenario. Lily is a what if this happened to me? What would I do? What woman would I become if this had happened to me? And it was influenced by the fact that my husband was in medical school. We were living through residency and all that as I was writing this book. And so it made sense to make her a doctor. My husband, before he went to medical school, worked on a ranch. He was good with cars, and he's quite obsessed with cars. And so am I. I love fast cars. He had a 66 Mustang. And so a lot of Blake was based on his love of cars. I didn't initially love working on cars when I first met him, but he's taught me, and that's kind of something that we would do together. And so I based Blake on that aspect of my life.
Bonnie, would you read us your first page?
20 miles per hour, 15, 10 miles per hour, 10? I'd survived the past 20 hours driving through traffic in cities across the country, and now I was stuck behind a tractor, going slower than a first-year med student suturing a wound. My fingers twitched, and I tapped the dash in a staccato beat. Each time I blinked, it took longer to lift my eyelids, as if miniature weights had been latched onto my eyelashes. My tire thumped over a pothole, and my eyes jolted open. Only 7 more minutes, and I'd be out of my car, if I could get around this John Deere. I'd moved away from one-lane gravel roads and this farming community for a reason. For a lot of reasons. My front bumper approached the massive planter attached to the tractor, which spanned beyond either side of the road. The gleaming blades spaced evenly along its metal bars made it resemble a medieval torture device. Maybe it wasn't a planter. My parents had moved me here when I was 10, and I'd never gotten involved in the agricultural community. Channeling my inner NASCAR driver, I weaved from one side of the road to the other. My mother, the illustrious Renee Hutchinson, expected me at 9 o'clock for a late dinner, and on time was my middle name. I'd used punctual as one of the words to describe me in my interview at the hospital. Never mind, I wasn't looking forward to being back in Renee's house, or the fact she'd coerced me into being here. The farmer finally turned left onto a crossroad, and I sighed. About damn time. I pressed my gas pedal to the floor and angled around the tractor. Only then did the large black and white animal rooted in the lane become visible. It lifted its head to meet my stunned stare. Shit! Cow!
Can you talk to us about that first scene? Because I was loving how you make things worse and then a little bit worse and then worse and worse and gross and worse and so funny and so believable. All of these improbable things happen, and yet somehow in your hands, they are believable. Please talk to us about that.
So I'm very familiar with cows and what a pain they can be. When I first wrote it, it was a deer that ran, because deer are a common problem. But then the deer ran off, and it was just, they were on the side of the road. It's like, so my sister actually said she needs to have a run-in with a cow, make it a cow. And if you have ever worked with cows, they are the most stubborn animals, and they're so entertaining. And so in the mud here in Idaho, it gets really, 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 really wet. If you get the standing water mud, your shoes will get sucked right off. And I've had that happen to me. And so it's just kind of based on my experiences with cows and their comedic timing, and how when they get out, they can be so frustrating to work with. And so I guess it's based on my real life experience of living next to cows for my whole life.
Well, but one thing that's so cool about this, though, is that knowing what your book is about, depending on how it's pitched, this is a way to set a tone where we know that we can carry through the story and it's not going to just be painful.
Right. Yes. So that's a big, huge theme in the book that I wanted to portray, is that it's okay for us to have hard things happen and still be able to laugh and still be able to enjoy life. Like, I wanted to set the stage, and it took a lot of work. It took a lot of effort, because initially it was way too heavy. And so I had to lighten it up and bring in that humor aspect. And so I could let the readers know from the very first chapter, it's going to tug at your heartstrings. You're going to feel things throughout this novel, but you'll also be able to laugh. You'll also be able to have fun in the mud with a cow and just, fall in love with these characters.
And I think it's so important to show that even if something terrible happens, you can still have fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's one of our greatest attributes as humans, is to be able to, after tragedy, carry on and eventually find the ability to laugh and love again.
And sometimes seeing an example in story is really helpful too.
Mm-hmm.
So many people go through this world with PTSD and loss and everything else. And I think when you read about a character that also has these things, it can be a little comforting. You're not alone in it. So let's talk about Maddie. I loved her, and she had autism. And I felt like she was the perfect, I loved the directness of someone with autism, like you always kind of know where you stand. Talk to us about that. Did you do a lot of research on autism? Like, how did you decide to come about with that character?
She actually is based on my nephew who has autism. And my sister was around when I was a teenager, and we helped kind of raise, because her husband was a pilot. So we worked together on raising him. And I've just always been really close to my nephew. And so I guess it was easy for me to come up with her character and make her authentic because I had the best example in my life. A lot of the things that Maddie says is something that he said before. And obviously, she became her own character. But it's nice to be able to have that personalized experience in your life with people. Because, I can research as much as possible, but until I have that real life interaction, then I can really bring those characters to life.
So, one thing that I found very amusing about your writing group, and there are, 20 of you?
I think there's 20 of us now.
There is so much life to the way that you give each other feedback. Can you talk about that process, the feedback that you got, the ways that, again, like hitting all the right emotional notes must have been so difficult. And I imagine that was a huge amount of your editing process. So, can you talk about that process with them, and also what advice you have for folks out there who are writing about characters who have this really broad emotional range?
So my first step is I send them to my sisters, this book, and they are very blunt, very, very blunt. Tell me how it is, because, we've grown up together, so we can be very blunt. And then I go through and I fix what they say. But with my writing group, the one I met through Manuscript Academy, they were very good about knowing, like just instinctually knowing, okay, well, you need to change this. And I think what we do is I would just put out there on the chat, because we have a Twitter chat group, and I would say, hey, does anybody want to do a beta read right now for me? I have this agent that's interested. I really want to, and they would oftentimes just really quickly do a 2-week turnaround beta read for me. And some of them were very detailed. They do the edit. Usually we do the side note edit, in Word. And then I just go through, and I would say a lot of the time, like their feedback was spot on, because they really kept their pulse on the industry, and they kind of knew what was selling and how we could make this pacing better. And that helped a ton.
So you're like the Austins.
Yeah, kind of.
Brontes.
Or the Brontes. I actually just bought the Bronte sisters collection works, and it has like gold lying pages, because I was like, oh, look, the Bronte sisters and the Austins. Yeah.
It's so lucky just to have that. And, I don't have a sister, but I think there must be nothing scarier than a sister's review. So this is done in dual point of views. Tell us the benefits. Tell us why you went this way, and give us tips for writing the dual point of view.
So I really like being able to see in a romance into the male perspective, to give a little bit more connection with the struggles that he is going through. And there's no better way to do that than to put the reader in his head. And I really wanted Blake to be a round character, to have a character journey as strong as Lily. And so I chose to go dual. Initially, this was actually an omnipotent perspective, and I had to change it, and it was in third person. So I changed it from third person omnipotent to first person personal. And I felt like that gave the reader a more direct connection with the characters right off. So that's why I ended up going with dual POV. I guess the best way to write dual POV, for me, it's easy to write the female perspective. Like, it's super easy because I'm a girl. And so it's really, really easy just to write that. But to make an authentic male character, I just turned to the men in my life and paid a lot of attention to the words they use. I tried to watch my husband's reactions when he was working on cars, like how he got frustrated, because, you punch an engine block and you're going to have bloody knuckles. And so those little details I like to pull out in my perspectives. I think it helps going deeper into the deep POV, is just putting in those details and making sure that you thread them throughout. And that helps.
That's true. We can see the little details through your character. And it's such a great device for building romantic tension too, because then it's a sort of question of, we can see what each character knows and the other one doesn't.
Correct.
And
yes.
why they do things. And I think that was really effective here too.
Yes. It helps to be able to be in someone else's head and know what they're thinking and what they're seeing, and the other person doesn't see that. So that definitely helps with romantic tension.
Do you have a chart of who knows what when?
I actually don't. Okay, so behind me, you have this whiteboard, and it's like a spider graph. This is my current work, and I just kind of scribble notes to myself as I'm going along. So I am a pantser, but I also now have a vague outline. And I guess I keep it in my mind. And in my suspenses, I have like this injury journal. So when they get hurt, I can remember that. So now I do it a little different, and I can't know too much. Otherwise, the magic is gone and then I don't write. So I have to give myself just enough information to be able to write, but not too much that the discovery is gone. So
Well, let's talk about the middle. So I thought you did a nice job with that. We all know that's kind of like the ups and downs of the journey. Tell us how you created such emotional shifts.
well, it's just like a lot about the healing. And anytime that Lily would come across something that reminded her of that scene. So I guess the first scene I ever wrote was the scene where she lost her husband and daughter. And then once I knew those details of that scene, anytime she came across something that would remind her of that, she put it out of her mind and went and became a surgeon. And then she's coming back and having to confront all of this baggage that she has never dealt with before. And so like these little details and these little memories are slipping through. So as she's going throughout the story, anytime she came across something that was either a childhood memory or a memory that ties her back to her family, then I knew that she'd have to have a reaction scene to that. And so as she was going through and having these wonderful experiences, there was times that she would need to reflect and react to that so you could understand that emotional change that was happening inside of her. So the reaction scenes are super important for conveying that emotional change throughout the novel.
I'm thinking about this now as you're speaking. I happen to be watching Wellmania on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen it, but I found it surprisingly affecting. And one thing that happens in this is that we see over and over again a character who has so much unprocessed emotion that when any little thing reminds her of a traumatic event in the past, she either passes out or just has an outsized emotional reaction. And so I'm thinking now, when we are writing characters who have not dealt with enormous amounts of emotion, it keeps everything so close to the surface that any little thing can cause a really big reaction in them. And there's all this tension just waiting. I have this image of like a balloon that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the littlest thing, it'll just, ow. How does a writer capture that and work with that and expand that balloon or give that character so much that they haven't dealt with? What do we do with that?
So I really love the idea or the concept of an emotional wound. And if you can pinpoint, okay, my character's emotional wound is this. And then as a writer, you've got to press on that emotional wound and always make it worse. And so as they're going forward through their story, you can't be nice because we love these characters. They're in our minds, they're in our hearts. And oftentimes I feel like, especially the first time through, I felt like I was being really nice because I was afraid to make them hurt, because when they hurt, I hurt. But then to make a more effective story, to make a more effective emotional balloon, to press on that emotional wound, to give them those challenges that really make them hurt, and then give them the power to overcome that. And that's when you have a really good emotional journey.
Do you think that if a writer is too comfortable, their characters aren't hurting enough?
Yes, I do completely. I like characters who bleed, who really bleed on the page. There's a time and a place for those really light and fluffy stories, but I just wanted like that real connection on all aspects. I want you to be able to connect with my characters, with the happy, with the sad, with the, every emotion in between. And in order to do that, you've got to give your characters that pain and let them feel that pain. And therefore, like I cried, like every time I had to write the accident scene, I was crying every single pass from the beginning all the way to the 30th or 40th edit. I was crying. So I think as a writer, if you're not feeling that emotion, that pain that your characters are feeling, that maybe you should consider to make it even harder, make it even worse, find a way to tug at it even more.
That's tough too, because suppose writers have grown up in a culture like ours where you're just kind of supposed to be like, well, bad thing happened, moving on, going to work tomorrow. Here we go. Let's be productive. So I bet writers often end up confronting their own emotional unavailability to the work a lot. How do they push past it?
That is a really tough question. As a writer, that is one thing that is very, very difficult, is being vulnerable. especially as I'm approaching this publishing stage, because the story has lived on my laptop. My daughter was 3 months old when I started writing it. She's going to be 17 when it's published.
Wow.
So it's kind of hard for me to put this out in the world because now everybody's reading about my vulnerability. It's like me being very vulnerable on the page and then putting it out there. And so I think that writers, we just have to be really brave and make sure that our focus is on the correct place. Because if we are focusing on all the negative aspects, all the negative parts of publishing, then we're not going to make it very far. It will drown you. And so I feel like if you focus on those readers that really are transformed by your wounds and they become better because of the story that you wrote, they are transformed by the story that you wrote, then you have done your job, and it's worth all the emotional pain. It's worth all the things that you have to uncover and reveal about yourself to put into your story, because that's why story is so important. It helps us learn. I mean, since the very dawn of time, we as people need story. And so I guess that's where it's worth it. I guess for writers who are confronting their emotional demons, to write story is to focus on those readers that will be changed by your story, those readers who need your story. If you maintain your focus on that, then you can overcome mountains.
It's so curious that you started this when you were a new mom. You know, like the idea that you started with a 3-month-old and now she's 17, because this is really a story about motherhood and like what that means, like on that like really conceptual level, right? And it's so there. Were a lot of your fears originally put into this book? Because I think like we have kids and we have those fears around our kids, all of it. Were they there when you started?
Yes. So as a new mom, you know, the most terrifying thing is to lose those you love. That's hands down the most terrifying thing. And so that, I guess, with Lily, that was kind of the initial gem. I was just looking at my husband who loves me and I love him dearly, and my sweet little baby. And it was like, if I was one of those people who lost everything, what would I do? How would I survive? And that's how Lily kind of came about. Luckily, I still have Emma and I still have my husband. We're all good. But that kind of is my story. I feel like it's a practice run for if you ever do have to confront those big life traumas and challenges, that you can read through the story and bolster your ability to handle unimaginable challenges through characters.
You know, that's not a bad place for people to start creatively. Like, what are you so afraid of that you can't stop thinking about it? One thing that I think is interesting is that you spent a lot of time revising. And one thing that I tell people when they're revising for a long period of time is don't overmix the dough. You know how if you're making something and there's flour in it and you just keep working it, it will get rubbery. How did you avoid that? Did you take breaks? Did you just inject new things? What did you do?
I overknew the dough, and then I don't know how I fixed it because I do think that initially I was so ambitious to make this story good that I sent it out to all beta readers everywhere. And I would take all the things and I'd say yes to everything. But what happened then is I went back into my story and it had transformed into something that I was like, this is not what I was going for at all. It was kind of like this Frankenstein novel. And so I did make the mistake of taking too much feedback. And so then I had to go back and I did a reverse outline, and I really looked at what was important to me as the author. I worked hand in hand with my sister Kelsey to take this Frankenstein draft and put it back to where I really wanted it. And then once I got it back to where I wanted it, then I went back to the beta reads. And I then became very selective with my beta readers if they were in my writing group. And I do one beta read at a time now, so that I can, instead of many at a time, and I'm getting all this input, I do one beta read at a time and I go through that in particular. And then I say, okay, I agree with this, or I don't agree with it. And if I don't agree with it, I've found that it's okay to say no. They see it in a different way than I do. So it's okay to say no in the editing process. Always be willing to say yes. But if it really doesn't ring true with your vision, then it's okay to say no. And then I would just take that draft and go to another beta reader and so on and so forth until I got to the point where I was getting the feedback that I wanted to hear from agents and editors. And then that's when I knew, okay, I've got it right. A lot of feedback did come from meeting with experts. They'd say, oh, there's not enough conflict. So then I added a whole new level of conflict into the book. And so, yeah, getting your advice from someone who is an expert in the industry really does help, knowing, okay, they really do know their stuff. And so trusting some of that and knowing that, you kind of have to be humble as a writer. So when you receive feedback from someone who does know more than you just say, okay, well, they do know more than me. Look at your story and say, okay, let's see how I can make it so that it has more conflict. It has the elements that they said, this is a little bit missing.
I do think if you're looking at a career, 17 years of trying and practicing, I know you have other books out too, but it is a practice. It's a practice to actually be able to take that in and really hear it and then move through the emotions of it, right? And then once you move through emotions of it, actually being in a place where you can make those changes, I think that's what makes the difference for writers. It sounds like that's what you're saying, like putting the emotion aside. And in turn, if you don't agree, just push that aside. It's okay. This is art. This is yours, right? And it has to be what you want. And if someone's pushing you to a place where you don't want it to be, regardless of how big of a, agent or editor they are, it's okay.
Yeah, I think that allowing yourself to feel after you get negative feedback or, feedback at all. So you get feedback and allowing yourself to feel I do it all the time. Every single time I get feedback that I'm like, they're just so wrong. And I go through and I rage and I cry and I'm like, yeah, no, I know better. And then let yourself feel that for a few days. I never go in and start changing after getting edited. I don't go in and right away and start changing them because you got to let yourself feel. And then after you feel all those emotions and you get to the point where you're like, okay, now I can look at it objectively. That's when you go back in and start editing. Because if you make emotional decisions, then you're going to end up over kneading the dough. And so taking the time to feel, then going in objectively, let's see, okay, am I feeling emotionally about this? Because we are very emotionally tied to our work. Or is this actionable feedback that is good? Or is it not?
And are you mad because it's true?
Yes. Yes. Because there are times when I've had to do major, major revisions. Like this book went through major revisions. I cut it from 140,000 words down to 60,000 words. And now it's at somewhere around 80 something thousand words. So the goal always has to be the end product. I want to be proud of my name on this novel. And I have to be humble enough and willing to accept that I don't know everything and take advice from others who do know more than me to make it the best product possible so that it can go out there and I can be like, yeah, I wrote a book and I'm so proud of it. So I don't care how many times I have to go through the critical eye of someone else, as long as the product, it's like a refined diamond rather than a lump of coal.
It's funny because I keep going back to food analogies here, and I can see how it could be kind of like you make something, you hand it to someone else. Oh, needs pepper. Hand it to someone else, needs oregano. Hand it to someone else, needs turmeric. Keep doing that too long, and you've got every spice from your cabinet in there, and you don't even know where to put the emphasis. You don't know this, you don't know that. So completely agree that you have to be open to the feedback, especially if it's someone who is in the industry and knows what they're talking about. If you agree, obviously there are many different correct ways to do something, but you also need to filter out all of the noise that's just out there.
Yes. And that's the hardest part, I would say, about editing, is being able to know when to take feedback and know when to say, no, that's too much spice. That's too much, oregano. It's too much salt. And I don't want it to be intolerable to take in. And that's where you really do just have to trust your intuition as an author to know what your story needs to give and take and to make it the perfect recipe possible.
Here's an impossible question. How do you know what feedback to take?
For me, oh goodness. Sometimes I try it. Sometimes it's obvious. Like you get feedback and you're like, obviously this is a good suggestion. I think it was Amy Bishop who said, I need to know why they're not going to be together by page 50. And if I don't know that, then the conflict isn't strong enough. So that was immediately, she was spot on. And I was like, oh my goodness, light bulb moment. I'm going to go back and I'm going to add this conflict. And it was a really hard edit. It was difficult. And she was completely right though. And then there's some other feedback that I'll get. And I'm like, that just doesn't ring true to my story. They're either not my reader or they just didn't really understand what I was going for. So they didn't connect in the way that I wanted to. And so that feedback's easy. But when you get that feedback that you're like, should I, shouldn't I? Sometimes I take it and I write both options. And then I look at both options and I'm like, okay, do I like this one or do I like this one better? Where is this one going? And then that's kind of how I determine the in the middle feedback. Is it what I want or what I don't want? And then I do have to go back and just analyze and say, okay, this is better, even though I maybe thought it wasn't going to be better. So it's just doing the work and figuring it out yourself that, eventually you do figure out, okay, this is right for the story or it's not.
I think it's sometimes hard pacing wise to know, because I think in theory, writers write maybe a first draft, like you're just kind of like lazily sailing across the bay and the wind's pretty good, the skies are clear. But once you really think about it, like books shouldn't be that one note. And by going, I know exactly the point you're talking about because I was like, because I noticed it. Like that's so interesting because I noticed that was there. And I was like, this is where this should be. And there was another point where I was like, yes, this should be here because it feels like a big reveal. But, the fact that it's here is keeping my interest within this tension. So like I picked up on those points that you're talking about and I thought they were smart. But I think it's interesting that you probably at one point, it was just lazily out there for the day sailing.
I really loved rabbit holes. Like when I first started writing, I just loved following where the journey was going. And like, when I went back and looked at it critically, I was just following these rabbit holes, like going day to day to day to day. And it's very important. I think that's one of the big light bulb moments of my writing career was you don't have to do day to day to day to day. They can do stuff in the background and we don't even need to hear about it. You can just go to the scene that matters and keep your pacing. Because if the scene doesn't move your story forward, then it's not necessary. So rather than lazily gliding in the bay, you have a direct target. And that's why pacing is so important. And I've studied pacing. I've taken workshops, classes. I have studied pacing so hard. And so now I kind of instinctually know it's easier for me to write now because instinctually I know at 10%, this is what should be happening. 25%, I need a turning point. 50% turning point. 75%, dark night of the soul. We got to have that. And so it's really nice to know that structure. Because going into this novel, I had no idea the structure. And I love that analogy of just lazily kind of going throughout the bay. But it's important to have structure in your writing so that you can have that direct path through the story and it never sags.
As someone who's not an expert on sailing, I can imagine that when you are there and the sail is holding the wind and pulling against it, and you've got the rope, and you just kind of need to feel how tight to pull so that you maintain that tension and nothing bad happens. You don't get too tense, it doesn't get too boring. I feel like that just probably turns into one of those instinct things that you build over time.
Yes, very instinctual, I believe. And there's a lot of story structure out there. I use many different versions. I have multiple ones that I put together and made one mash of what works for me. But that takes years of study, and I think my favorite, is Michael Haig's The 3-Act Story Structure in the 7 Stages. Like that one to me clicks. And so I write a draft and I retrofit my draft into that story structure, make sure I'm hitting all the points before I send it out to my alpha and beta readers.
That's nice though, because you can then be like, okay, here's everything I've got. Clearly, I can cut a little bit to get myself to these points faster. I like that. So, Bonnie, can you tell us just some of the things that helped you along the way and some of the advice you have for writers out there listening?
I guess my biggest advice is to find your community and to stay positive. There's so many voices saying, this is awful, this is awful, this is awful, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But if you find all the reasons why you're here, and you find that community that kind of reinforces the positive aspect of writing, then you'll be around for longer than the negative voices are. You'll be in this, because I think it's really sad for authors and writers who are only in the industry for 6 years or so, and then they're out. But finding your community, finding the positive aspects of writing, finding your why as to why you're here is very important. And then focusing on that throughout your journey so that you stay here. And then you can be one of those positive voices for those who are coming into the industry, and they'll stay around for a very long time, changing the world with your stories.
Oh, I love that. Well, I'm so happy that this worked out. I'm so happy you kept going. I'm so happy you found your writing community who give you energy when there's so much in publishing that takes it away. Tell us where and when we can find your book.
So my debut launch date is July 16th, and it's being distributed by Simon and Schuster. So wherever books are sold, I believe, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, but yeah, and the independent bookstores, wherever they decide to stock it. And of course, you can download the ebook and get it on your Kindle. And I do have an audiobook coming out with recorded books, so that's exciting. Anyway, so yeah, what happens in Idaho, July 16th? It's summer, yay!
Yay. We're so happy for you, Bonnie. Congratulations.
Yes.
I know that those of you out there don't know kind of what it looks like when we are talking to our writer friends behind the scenes, but Bonnie has been so lovely for so long and such a lovely part of our community. And I'm just so happy we get to know you.
Oh, well, thank you. Same goes for you.
Where can they find you online?
Instagram, I'm author Bonnie Jo Pierson. Also, I have a website. It's bonniejopearsonauthor.com. You can find me on there. I do have a newsletter that I'm going to be better at writing newsletters for going forward. I'm on Twitter and on TikTok. So those are all my socials.
Well, Bonnie, congratulations. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope all of you out there will go out and get a copy.
Thank you.
We are so glad that you joined us. And as always, we appreciate your feedback. Just head on over to the iTunes store and let us know what you think. It not only helps us make this podcast be the best it can be, but it also affects our ratings within the iTunes platform.
We'd love to hear from you. If you're feeling brave and want to submit your page for our First Pages podcast, you can send it to academy@manuscriptwishlist.com with First Pages podcast in the subject line. We'd also just love to hear from you.
And if you'd like to learn more about the Manuscript Academy and everything we have to offer, just jump on over to manuscriptacademy.com.